What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller, Shane Black from Hook'emHeadlines.com. We're coming back at y'all today with our in-depth preview for the Alabama game. Texas plays Alabama this Saturday night under the lights, 6 p.m., September 9th at Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa. College game day will be on site this weekend in Tuscaloosa. I mean, there's a ton of fanfare surrounding this game. There's going to be a ton of big-time recruits visiting, a lot of Texas targets there, and I mean, there's a good chance that this could be the most important non-conference game of the entire college football regular season. Texas coming off a win over Rice last weekend. We've talked about that win quite a bit on the channel already this week, so we'll kind of keep that recap at a minimum. But if you want to see more on what we're thinking about that game, I'll link down some of those videos in the description below. Alabama coming off a 56-7 win over Middle Tennessee last weekend. We haven't talked as much about kind of that Alabama film study or, what they're looking like heading into the Texas game. This is my thought on it, Shane. I think that, there's similarities between Alabama and Texas here in the sense that I think both game plans are pretty vanilla for the season opener. For Alabama, Jalen Milroe was able to hit some deep shots last week. I think the Middle Tennessee kind of sold out on trying to pressure the quarterback, limiting the ground game. You kind of saw that in the box score stats. Milroe had a lot of successful rushing plays, but a lot of those were on. One was a broken play that was like a fumbled snap that he took in for one of his 2 rushing touchdowns. But Jason McClellan averaged 3.9 yards per carry. I don't think Roydell Williams was much better on his 7 carries. Former Texas commit Jamarian Miller it was like 14 rushing yards on 4 carries. I don't think Haynes was much more productive than that either. I don't know how much we could say we really saw out of Milroe, because if you're facing a Middle Tennessee defense and secondary that's not properly equipped to handle the deep ball, I actually think Jalen Milroe and that Alabama receiving corps can do a lot of damage. So I don't know how much we learned about either team in the first week is the long story short here. I think Milroe is a talented quarterback. I think he can do a lot with his legs. I think he does have arm talent, but we haven't seen a ton on film from him. I think there's ways to pressure him and get in his head. I think that Texas's interior defensive line is going to play a big role in disrupting Alabama's offense in this game. And this is not an Alabama running game that scares me a ton. If they had Jahmyr Gibbs, it's a different story, but he's off in the NFL now. He was tremendous for Alabama all last season, was very productive against Texas. Alabama's defense is a different story in terms of how much they scare me. I think that's one of the better defenses in the country, if not like maybe a top 5 defense. Those are kind of some of my thoughts on Bama coming into this game. What about you, Shane?
Yeah, so I think that we shouldn't take a ton away from week 1 on either side. And looking specifically at Alabama, the one thing that we really did learn was that it looks like Jalen Milroe is going to be the starter, at least in this Texas game. I mean, all 3 quarterbacks did take some snaps, but Milroe took those opening snaps, and he also played most of the game. So we know that Jalen Milroe is a dynamic dual-threat quarterback. I mean, we did our own breakdowns of him when he committed to Texas, over 2 years ago. But I think it will be interesting to see kind of who is designated as the spy, how often Texas is spying, how multiple they get in the back. But I think you said it best. There is no Jahmyr Gibbs in this rushing attack. If you go down the list, you look at McClellan, Roydell Williams, Justice Haynes, Richard Young, even Jan Miller. They're all high 4-star, 5-star guys. But he isn't like these workhorse Alabama backs that we've seen in the past. So while we know this offseason that Saban wanted to become more run-heavy, going back to his mid-2010 teams, I don't know how successful they can be in doing that. I think there are definitely some matchups that Texas can exploit, which is a promising sign. If you would have looked at, Texas going into games against Alabama, even last year, you're struggling to find where Texas could maybe find some success. But I think the Longhorns match up really well, especially on the outside. I think you could argue that the skill talent on Texas is better than what Bama is putting out there. We're not seeing that wide receiver core that used to have, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Henry Ruggs, all those guys. That's kind of out the door. Isaiah Bond led the team with 76 receiving yards last week, and Jermaine Burton, Georgia transfer, is always in the mix, but no one who really scares me. And I think that's a really good sign is I don't think Alabama is really going to be able to knock you out of this game with points. that is something to, be positive about, because what we saw from the Texas defense last week and what we expect going forward, we think this is going to be a strong unit that can limit anyone they play. So if you're now facing an offense that, one, might be a little one-dimensional, and two, isn't as explosive as, some of these other offenses around the country, I think that gives Texas a really good shot, and I think they should roll into Tuscaloosa with confidence that they can win this game.
I'd like to do this for how we kind of take a look at how each team matches up. So we kind of mentioned some of the high-level thoughts that we have heading into this game. We're going to take a look at like what Alabama looks like for each position group, and then how Texas matches up and so let's go ahead and get started. We talked about Milroe a little bit already. There's a lot of underrated storylines for, I think, Jalen Milroe heading into this game that aren't being talked about a lot. We mentioned it on the show. Obviously, he's a former Texas commit. I do think he's going to have a chip on his shoulder heading into this game. I mean, the reason he decommitted from Texas in the first place was that back in 2020 was because Texas landed a commitment from Quinn Ewers. I know a lot has happened since then. They're different players now, but I mean, Jalen Milroe was recruited to Alabama by Steve Sarkisian. Sarkisian's now at Texas. Sarkisian also recruited Quinn Ewers back to Texas. And so I think that, that's going to be sticking to Milroe's mind heading into this game. Beyond that, Milroe is a talented quarterback. It's incredibly difficult to stop talented dual threat quarterbacks, not just for Texas, but just generically in college football. You saw that last week with some of the plays that Milroe was able to make that were off schedule. I mentioned that, with that fumbled snap that he took in for a score. I think for Milroe, I think the question is, how is he going to be able to digest what the Texas defense throws at him? I mentioned with the interior pass rush, but, can he go through those? Can he go through multiple progressions? How is he looking in the short and intermediate passing game? How is he fitting those tight throw windows, between the numbers? I got to give Milroe credit, though. He looks much more confident, composed, and just like a stronger fundamental quarterback than he did last season. I know we're one game in, but you want to talk about a transformation that Quinn Ewers made during the offseason. I think Jalen Milroe also progressed a lot as Alabama's starting quarterback during the offseason. So, I think for Milroe, if there's a lot of Texas fans out there that I think are just disregarding his ability to make plays with his arm beyond maybe a nice deep ball or two, and then, just making that first read. I think he's better than that at this point. He's a little bit more developed. At the same time, I don't think he's going to be the best passing quarterback we face all season, and I do think there's a way to rattle him if we can get good interior pass rush. I posted this kind of situational stats on the Twitter page earlier today. Milroe has not been very good when he's forced to throw outside the pocket. When he's forced outside the pocket due to pressure, he's got it's like a 43.2 completion percentage. It's 0 or 1 passing touchdown, 2 interceptions, and I think it's about 4 or 5 turnover-worthy plays, and then 14 pressures and 2 sacks. 7 of 16, 60 passing yards. And when he's in the pocket, 37 to 55 for a 67.3 completion percentage, 431 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, 1 interception. On those dropbacks, he was pressured 17 times and sacked 4. One key part about those stats to me is that he had 7 rushes for 48 yards on pressure scrambles, which means that when he's going outside the pocket. So that's how I thought he would have been doing more damage on those scramble plays due to pressure. What that tells me, it's obviously a limited sample size, but if Texas can find a way to get some interior pressure on him and get him evading the pocket, you might be able to find some opportunities to get him rattled early on. Those are stark enough statistics to me that at least give you some indication of where you might be able to attack Alabama.
Yeah, and I think going back to your other point about Milroe kind of coming into this game pretty juiced up, I think that Texas could use that to their favor. A young quarterback like this who's going to really want to play his best against a university he was formerly committed to, I think could lend itself to some mistakes, especially if Texas who we know is always solid on script and jumping out to early leads. If Texas can get a bit of a lead on Alabama, and that kind of forces Milroe to start pushing the ball down the field, I think we could see some mistakes. And one of my keys to this game is who can avoid that costly turnover. Then we all think. I would agree with you there. I do think that there is some credence to this quarterback battle going as long as it did. And that was because no one really established themselves as the true alpha throughout the offseason. And Milroe definitely seems to be the guy at this point, but there's definitely still some question marks in his game. And I think the obvious question marks are kind of that short to intermediate passing. And you mentioned if you can kind of get him outside the pocket, that's advantage defense. So I think that plays well into Texas' hands. We saw T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, Alfred Collins really kind of blowing up the middle of Rice's interior line. So I think it's what happens once Milroe gets on the edge. Are there Texas defenders there ready to make a play? I expect a lot of zone in the back because you're not really going to be wanting to turn your back on him. I certainly don't think it's going to be a game where he's going to beat you through the air, because I don't think Alabama has that kind of talent on the outside to help him out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I honestly do have some questions for Alabama's offensive line. We'll get into the offensive line a little bit later, but I think that Alabama actually suffered from some of the same issues that Texas did in week one in terms of miscommunications along the offensive line. Alabama gave up some stuffs in week one, some pressure on Milroe too. And so I think there's ways that you can kind of exploit that, that dual threat tendency that he has, and maybe some of the indecision that he have if you get him outside the pocket throwing on the run. I do think if you force him to have to look into the flats and to intermediate stuff, and you can close on the Alabama wideouts, it could be a long day for this Alabama passing game.
Yeah, and just to hop in right here, I completely agree with that. I think you got to keep everything in front of you when you're facing a quarterback like Milroe, who, is pretty adept at throwing the deep ball and beating you over the top. Make them take 12, 15 plays to beat you down the field. If Jalen Milroe can, complete passes at a 75% clip, even if it's only like 6 or 7 yards per attempt, do it. Because I think where Texas gets in trouble is over the top. But I do not see out the Alabama offense sustaining long drives quarter after quarter after quarter. I think they are going to get a bit antsy, and that's where you get those turnovers.
Agreed. I think this is a good transition point to look at their running game now, because one of the big question marks for me for Alabama in this game is, do they try to set the tone through the air or on the ground? Because I think the obvious answer when you look at it is on the ground. Like, Nick Saban mentioned it during the offseason. He wants Alabama to be more of a rushing team. They have more established talent at running back, at least some guys that have proven themselves in live game action, namely Williams and McClellan. But I don't think that Alabama's going to be able to run the ball very well on Saturday. Texas's interior defensive line is just too stout. T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy were awesome last week against the run. And I think Texas's linebackers are going to be fantastic against the run this week too. The only question I have for Texas in terms of where Alabama can attack is if they're trying to run off tackle a little bit and try to attack the edges. I think you can potentially exploit Ethan Burke a little bit in this game. Alabama has a lot of size along the offensive line, especially at tackle. And Ethan Burke, about 6'6", 255, 260. I think he's still kind of a work in progress with his run defense. I think he'll get there, but it's just not quite there yet. That potentially could be a point of emphasis for me, but I think just to say that there's only one really area that Alabama could attack kind of goes to show how nitpicky I have to get even on a very, very deep dive basis. For Alabama's running game, they don't have that workhorse back, like the Jahmyr Gibbs, or, if you want to go back even further, your Derrick Henrys, your Mark Ingrams, your Eddie Lacy's, all those guys. You have a lot of backs that they're going to rotate. Like I said, at week one, it was pretty much running back by committee. McClellan letting carries as expected, but you saw Jalen Milroe get 4 attempts. You saw Roydell Williams get 7. What did Haynes have, like 5? Something like that. And so I'd imagine it's going to be running back by committee again this weekend. Jason McClellan did have that long run against Texas last year, but we talked about that. I think Jalen Ford kind of misread on that play. he's been one of the best linebackers in the country since the second half of last season. I don't think you're going to be able to count on him missing those reads this game. Otherwise, for Alabama's ground game, I mean, if Middle Tennessee, this is where I'll put it. If Middle Tennessee is able to stuff, what did I get? 6 Alabama runs last week, I think it was. I would need to look at that to confirm. But if Middle Tennessee is stuffing that many runs at that high of rate against Alabama, I think that Texas is going to be able to hold their own and just be very, very disruptive along the defensive front. I don't think you have to load the box necessarily. I think you can match up with like even numbers and still feel good about where you're at. So what are your thoughts on kind of the matchup there?
Yeah, so I think Texas matches up well with the Alabama rushing attack. If you take away quarterback runs last week, Alabama only averaged 4.5 yards per carry on the ground. With that, extremely talented stable of running backs is actually pretty crazy to think about. And, like you mentioned, Alabama's dealing with a little bit of their own problems on the offensive line. And what we saw with T'Vondre Sweat and Alfred Collins, and just the ability to throw so many bodies out there, quarter after quarter, that will stack up. And people always talk about, keep running the ball. It's going to break come the fourth quarter. I don't know if it ever will break against this Texas defense because they run out so many bodies on the defensive line. They're going to be relatively fresh throughout. Like if you look at snap counts last weekend, I know it doesn't always tell the whole story because Texas had a big lead in the second half, but it was, pretty staggered throughout. And I think that's a really good thing to see. And you mentioned that you could find some trouble on the edge. I think that's where Alabama, is their most solid on the offensive line. You have J.C. Latham at right tackle, who's going to be a first rounder in April. And then, 5-star Caden Proctor at left tackle, who could be Kelvin Banks 2.0. I don't want to throw that around willy-nilly, but he's a hell of a player and a hell of a prospect. So I think kind of in the interior is where Texas can really make some noise. And I think that might surprise some people early on in the game, because you think of Alabama, you think of that physicality pushing you around. But when Texas pushes back on that offensive line, I think that could surprise some people, and it could, be a game changer, because if Alabama's getting stuffed early, you get them behind the chains, they got no chance. I would love to see Jalen Milroe try to beat this Texas defense by having to throw it 15 times on 3rd and long. I just don't think that's happening. If you get this Alabama offense off script behind the chains, massive advantage to Texas. So I think kind of stopping the rushing attack, and that starts in the middle, is crucial to this game.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to elaborate on the stats I was saying earlier. So I think this actually paints a pretty vivid picture where Alabama's at with their ground game. So, all the struggles we talked about for Texas running the ball in week 1 against Rice and getting stuffed multiple times. So Middle Tennessee stuffed Alabama 5 times, 3 tackles for loss. Alabama ran the ball 38 times. They had 38 rushing attempts. Now, Texas ran the ball 36 times against Rice, was stuffed 6 times, 4 tackles for loss. That's not a stark contrast. Alabama, they might have been a little bit better in week 1, not much. So I don't know. I think that Texas is going to have an opportunity here to kind of take away that phase of Alabama's offense pretty early in the game. Like you said, if you do, putting Milroe in 3rd and long situations, you don't feel good about that. That's going to give Texas, I'd imagine, some short fields for 1. And for 2, you're going to have to keep that Alabama defense out there a lot. It gives you opportunities to wear them down, but Alabama wide receivers and tight ends, this is another problematic area, another area with a lot of question marks for the Tide compared to what you usually get from a Nick Saban team. You mentioned Isaiah Bond earlier. He had some deep balls in week 1. Sounds like, at least from Alabama's perspective, talked with an Alabama guy today and, doing a collab show over on Mark Rogers TV, and then talked with people over at Bama Hammer, our Alabama side on Fansided, earlier this week. They have more confidence in Jermaine Burton. He had some issues last year, the Georgia transfer. I still think, Alabama's wide receivers were not very good last season, especially against Texas, more of a liability than they were an asset. I feel the same way this year. I don't think that Alabama's receiving core has improved enough. I mentioned it earlier, Alabama did connect on some deep balls. Maybe you see one of these guys break free. I think you still can count on maybe a big player or two from this Alabama receiving core. Tight end, I still don't see much that blows me away. I believe you say Amari Niblack was their leading receiver last week. CJ DePrey, I believe, is their starter, and he's the most viable target in different situations in game. They're probably going to use more tight end heavy sets this game than they did against Middle Tennessee. I think that's going to be part of Alabama trying to run the ball a little bit more commonly, and then you probably try to set up some stuff out in the flats, play action, some RPO stuff to get Milroe some easy looks to some of his tight end targets. So I do think that they're going to get the tight end involved a little bit more here than they did week one. I think week one, that level of inactivity for the tight ends in this game. I'm still going to give the edge, though, to Texas here. Texas's coverage was fantastic in week one. I think Texas matches up really well with the Alabama wideouts. Let's not shy away from the fact we talked about this. Texas has a lot of defensive backs that are really good at defending the deep ball. Gavin Holmes has amazing straight line speed. Don't look away from him potentially being a game breaker here on Saturday. I won't say a game breaker, but like a difference maker. I think he can be. This is a game where he can potentially shine. Again, I mentioned I think he's got the best straight line speed of any of our cornerbacks. Terrence Brooks in the short and intermediate passing game, guy's a ball hawk. Like his ball skills are amazing. He's just all around improved, pretty physical. I think in those situations where Alabama is trying to throw between that 5 and 15-yard mark, that's where Terrence Brooks can come in to really shine. And then Manny Muhammad, he gave Texas a lot of good reps in week one. Very physical, very good ball skills, great at drawing turnovers. I know he's young, but a lot of these Alabama receivers are young too. And so I think that Muhammad could also take advantage of some matchups here at the field and on the boundary. And Watts, obviously, I think he'll be good. As I said earlier, probably matching up mostly against Jermaine Burton.
After the game, I said Texas was clearly the better team on the outside. And I'm only more confident in every single secondary position for the Longhorns this year. They return, the three starters in Barron, Watts, and Jaron Thompson. And then you have Terrence Brooks, Gavin Holmes, Manny Muhammad replacing the Deshaun Jameson cornerback looks. And you have Jalen Catalon replacing Anthony Cook. So I feel more confident about every single position on this Longhorn secondary. And the Alabama passing attack is relatively the same, with a lot of the same names as it had last year. And tight end, you mentioned tight end, they're going to use the tight end more. So Benson's another guy that you can say he's a new name to this room. And he is a speedster. I don't think he's going to be like an 8 catch for 150-yard a game. Like that's not going to happen. I think there will be 1 or 2 times where Alabama gets over the top against his secondary. It's just bound to happen. But in general, I think the secondary is going to have a massive advantage on the Alabama passing attack.
This is probably the most interesting of the conversations, at least like probably the closest. So Bama's got a massive offensive line, right? I think 3 guys that are over 6'5", 335, maybe 4. They average around 6'5", 6'6", 335, 340. So they're bigger by a good margin along the offensive line than Texas is along the defensive line. Really, only T'Vondre Sweat is in that ballpark size-wise among Texas's starters. I think for Alabama, I mentioned they did have some struggles along the offensive line in week one, but they got some really, really solid guys. Tyler Booker, I think Caden Proctor is going to be really, really good. Their freshman starting offensive tackle, J.C. Latham, all SEC caliber guy. Alabama's starting offensive line is a solid unit. Now, there are some areas you can exploit here, but Texas's defensive line, I think, if they can give them problems last year, Texas has so much depth that they can rotate so many guys. Got so many athletic freaks, to be frank. Along the defensive line, you still got Alfred Collins. You still got Vernon Broughton, who was tremendous, I think, in week one. Alabama's going to be tested more so than they will most other games this season. This is another situation where I'm probably going to put it at a coin flip because I think there's going to be some situations where Alabama wins some battles. I think Texas is going to win some. Where I feel more confident about Alabama's offensive line, in true pass sets, they were pretty good in week one. when Middle Tennessee wasn't throwing anything crazy at them, Alabama was able to just overwhelm them, which sounds obvious, but Texas's offensive line was supposed to do that against Rice, and they didn't last weekend. I think when Alabama has to start pulling more guards, Texas throws more stunts, twists, things like that in pressure situations. That's when you're really going to press the communication of this Alabama offensive line, and you're really going to find some of the weak points there. And I know that PK is going to have something ready. Like Anthony Hill is going to be a major X factor in that. See if they can get some different stunts to get him pressuring the quarterback. I think Ethan Burke can play a role here. He had a sack and a half in week 1. So I'm going to leave this at a coin flip, but I do think there's going to be some back and forth.
And at the tackle position, Caden Proctor and J.C. Latham. I mean, I know this will only be Proctor's second game, but those are two of the better tackles. That's one of the better tackle duos that Texas is going to see all season. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Ethan Burke and Barron Sorrell and Justice Finkley and guys like that match up, because there's a chance that they can just get swallowed up and completely taken out of this game. And we've seen that in the past where Texas can just get absolutely no pass rush from the edge. And that, really puts a lot of burden on the interior line. And I know we have a lot of confidence in those guys on the interior, but when they're the only ones creating pressure, that is certainly a problem. So,
yeah, I think where you attack if you're Texas is still that interior offensive line, because on one front you have Darian Dalcourt, is the starting right guard. He was one of his worst games last season was against Texas. He allowed, I think it was like 4 quarterback pressures, their lowest graded in pass blocking. I think that Texas can do some good things in that matchup. Also, Seth McLaughlin, the center, I think he's solid. He's been a little bit a little bit more reliable consistently from the numbers and the metrics than Dalk. But McLaughlin still was Alabama's lowest graded starting interior offensive lineman in run blocking against Power 5 opponents last season. There's an opportunity to, on that kind of middle right part of the line, I think you can be disruptive there. I think that's where you have to press. I mean, the fact that there's 2 starters right next to each other and they were having some miscommunications along the offensive line last weekend, I have to imagine that's a point of concern for Alabama. It's kind of like what Texas had last week between DJ Campbell and Hayden Connor, in a sense. Where I think Jake Majors did pretty well last week, but, I would be remiss if Texas didn't have any concerns about Hayden Connor and, whoever's playing at right guard this week, probably Cole Hudson. Okay, let's move over to Texas's offense versus Alabama's defense. So I think that we can both say that the defense is going to have more advantages than the offense for both teams. That is pretty easy to get out of the way. Also, when you're looking at Texas's matchup on paper with Alabama, it's going to look a lot better. But yeah, let's go ahead and dig into it. So Quinn Ewers versus just the Alabama defense. I mean, I think that Texas is going to be very RPO heavy this week. They ran, I think it was 7 RPO passes on Saturday against Rice last Saturday. Quinn Ewers was perfect on those, 86 yards. I think it was a touchdown or 2. Second best QBR of any Power 5 QBs. He can run that. You keep things simple. He looked really sharp in the short and intermediate passing game. I think that's probably a good way to go for Texas to set the tone in the passing game this week. Where I start getting concerned about Quinn Ewers is with some of the interior pressure that I think Alabama can generate. They got a guy like Jaheim Otis that's just going to be a home wrecker up front. I mentioned him in the 3 problematic players for Alabama against Texas. He's very large, but he's like 6'4", 330, somewhere in that ballpark. And he's going to present a ton of issues, whether he's playing defensive tackle or over the football at nose. Jake Majors doesn't have the size advantage. I don't think any of Texas' offensive line would have the size advantage there. That point's a little concerning to me. I think if Alabama can get the interior pass rush, that's going to be problematic for Ewers trying to get through his reads, and especially trying to get the deep ball off. That's probably the area that impacts the most. I got to say, for Quinn Ewers versus the Alabama defense, I'm probably giving the edge to the Alabama defense. I just think up and down, they're solid. Their secondary's young, but they got a lot of solid guys back there. Terry and Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry, both really, really solid corners. If they're able to go Malachi Moore, Jalen Key, both solid. Malachi Moore at the star position, and then Jalen Key at the safety position. And Caleb Downs at the other safety spot, I believe he's their starting strong safety. He was really, really good in week one. I actually mentioned him among the problematic players because he's really versatile. He can make a lot of plays. He's very smart, hard hitter. Don't look at the true freshman next to his name and assume that Texas can, get him all jumbled up and confused in the secondary. I think that he knows where to be. He's going to make some plays. I think he led Alabama in tackles in week one.
I also just trust, the consistency of their defense compared to what Ewers brings to the table. You kind of know week in and week out what you have with Alabama, where, the highs with Ewers will be very high, but there are also a good amount of lows mixed in there as well. So I think when it's all said and done and December rolls around, we will be looking back at the 2023 Alabama defense as one of, if not the best defense in the country. So I think just at every level, they have playmakers that are going to be disruptive for Quinn. I think we'll get into this, as we progress in this preview, but it's going to be the guys around Quinn. How do they perform? Because if the offensive line plays well and the running backs come to play and he gets a little help on the outside, that makes Quinn look a whole lot better.
We would be completely overlooking some of the better Alabama linebackers and edge rushers if we didn't mention Dallas Turner. I mean, I'm sure that will be looming large in Quinn Ewers' mind on Saturday. Texas has to be able to protect him off the edges. Chris Braswell, also a pretty productive edge rusher, opposite of Dallas Turner. Next up is Texas's ground game versus Alabama's front seven. I think that Texas can find a way to set the tone on the ground in this game. You got C.J. Baxter coming back. I think he'll probably be on a pitch count this week, probably around 7 or 10 carries. Jonathan Brooks, I think, will be getting a heavy workload on Saturday. And I think Jaden Blue is going to get a lot of looks too. And Robinson's probably going to be looking at some motion, different set packages where he gets moved around pre-snap. He'll probably have a chip on his shoulder facing his former team on Saturday. Where I become concerned about Texas's matchup on the ground versus Alabama's defense, still the interior offensive line. I don't think that Texas necessarily has the movement, the communication, the cohesion that they want along the interior offensive line to deal with all of those hog mollies that Alabama has up front. I do think it's probably a positive that Cole Hudson's getting the start on Saturday over DJ Campbell. So that's good. I put up something on the site earlier today. Did you know that Cole Hudson was the highest graded in run blocking last year of any of our players against Alabama?
I did not know. I did not know that.
So that's a little surprising to me. I mean, I guess you have to consider that a positive, but we just didn't run the ball against them very well last year. So I don't know how much stock you can put into that. You're going to be looking at a situation where Texas gets guys like Robinson and Jonathan Brooks involved almost as much through the air. Some easy stuff out of the backfield, some pre-snap motion. I think for Brooks, some of that stuff out in the flats like we saw against Rice and against Washington in the bowl game last year. He's really good at finding his way through traffic, getting some of those big gains. And so I think we're going to be relying on them through the air a good bit too. Baxter will be put to the test. It just really sucks. It's really unfortunate that he got injured on that first big play that he broke off from scrimmage against Rice. He was bogged down on his first few runs and then, finally gets that 32-yarder and then lands on the football, ends up with what I would assume is bruised ribs. I don't know what the exact injury was, but rib injury. If he's able to play in week 2, it's probably not cracked ribs. As someone that has had bruised ribs before in sports, I can't imagine what the next level pain is beyond that. I think a question mark here is how do you get guys like Jaden Blue and C.J. Baxter performing when you're trying to run in zone schemes? I don't trust our offensive line enough yet to run pulling stuff. Maybe with Cole Hudson out there instead of DJ Campbell, someone that proved that he can do some of that pulling stuff last year in gap schemes. But I think that Texas is going to have to keep it pretty simple on the ground.
Yeah, I think the clear advantage here is to the Alabama front seven. I mean, you just mentioned it. Last year, Texas 33 carries for 79 yards, and that's with Bijan Robinson and Rojo. The Texas backs are pretty unproven, and the Alabama defensive line and the front seven in general is not. Guys like Jaheim Otis is going to be an absolute game wrecker, and I really don't know how the Texas offensive line plans to deal with that. But if you're getting pushed back against Rice, you're going to have a problem with these guys. G. Modis, Tim Smith, Tim Keenan. We mentioned Dallas Turner kind of coming off the edge. Chris Broswell, you mentioned as well. I think Texas is going to really, really struggle to run the ball, like really struggle. And that's going to put a lot of more pressure on Ewers. I think Sark is going to have a fair amount schemed up, in the sense that you're going to see a lot of those behind the line of scrimmage passes that almost, work as like pseudo runs. And that's kind of how the offense is going to get those yards. But I think purely when it comes to carries and rushing yards, it's going to be low for Texas. I think it's going to be very low.
This is where the conversation for Texas's matchups on offense versus Alabama's defense gets pretty interesting. The wide receivers and tight ends versus Alabama's secondary. So, I mean, if I'm just looking at it on paper, I get like Alabama does have a solid secondary. A lot of NFL level guys back there. Texas also has a lot of NFL guys. And I think in terms of depth and talent, Texas does have the edge here. We don't need to break down every matchup to know that what really matters for Texas's wideouts versus Alabama's secondary. For one, matters how Quinn Ewers is getting them the football. And for two, how good the blocking is on the outside. Like, if Texas is getting some, you mentioned it earlier, I do think the horizontal passing game in a way will take the place of a lot of the running game to get Texas some short yard pickups, third and short, or, get closer, more manageable third down situations. If you're getting the ball out to Xavier Worthy, you got guys like Jordan Whittington, if Adonai Mitchell is blocking, high effort on the boundary, Texas can get some big gains out there. I have no doubt that one-on-one, these Texas receivers can make a lot of these Alabama defensive backs miss. I mean, Xavier Worthy, clear threat in space. I think Adonai Mitchell, I think for him, this might be a tough matchup this weekend because, they like to utilize him in the deep threat, one-on-one things on the boundary. And I don't know how much Texas is going to try to test that cover 7 defense. We saw some issues for Quinn Ewers last year when he was facing those different, more complicated coverage schemes. I know that he played really well in the first quarter against Alabama last year, but I think that Alabama's going to throw some more. They run a lot of bracket coverage anyway, but I think they're going to throw some more stunts at Quinn this year. For a guy like Adonai Mitchell, he might be limited this game. Jordan Whittington is going to be key. You want to use him between the numbers. I think he has an opportunity to have a big day on Saturday. JT Sanders, though, is, I think, the real key. Texas needs to get him the ball because he's just a matchup nightmare. I harped on this last year. I know that there were I think there was 1 or 2 missed PI plays, and Alabama was able to pretty much remove him as a factor in the second half because him and Hudson Card didn't have as natural of a connection as him and Quinn Ewers do. JT Sanders can be a game breaker on Saturday. So I'm actually just in this particular matchup going to give the slight edge to the Texas wideouts and tight ends over Alabama's secondary. But a lot of this rests on Quinn Ewers and the Texas offensive line if Texas can actually maximize their wideouts and tight ends.
Yeah, I completely agree with that last point you just made. But this is going to be one of the most fun matchups to watch because of what you said earlier. Just the talent on both sides of the ball here. Ton of NFL guys. And Kool-Aid McKinstry is likely the number 1 corner selected in the 24 draft. Terrion Arnold was a freshman All-American last year. And you mentioned Caleb Downs looked really, really good in week 1, and he was a high 5-star in the 2023 class. So just a lot of talent for Alabama on that side of the ball. And I think Texas matches that talent stride for stride. I'm going to give the slight edge to the Longhorn receivers just for a couple of reasons. I think, say it was just one-on-one matchups, and you're running Xavier Worthy against Kool-Aid McKinstry and Adonai Mitchell against Terrion Arnold, and maybe Jordan Whittington in the slot against Malachi Moore. I feel confident that in one-on-one situations, Texas would get the better of Alabama like 60% of the time. I think it's very even, but I would give the slight edge to Texas. Now it's up to Quinn Ewers to diagnose where those matchups are and how he's going to attack them. I thought you made a good point about Jay Witt and Jatavian Sanders. I think there's going to be a lot of space in the middle of the field, and I think making Caleb Downs prove that he's fundamentally sound and making him prove he pushing him kind of up the field and putting some pressure on him, I think is going to be pretty key. Next to Caleb Downs at the safety position is Jalen Key, grad transfer from UAB. This will, I don't want to speak about the last 4 years with UAB, but I think this is going to be the biggest game of his career. So are there kind of some jitterbugs early with those two safety?
He's day-to-day with an injury too.
Is he?
Okay. Yeah. Him
okay. Okay. I knew. Okay. So I think that's interesting regardless. Because then if you're looking behind Key, like a Christian Story, or I think they have Devontae Smith as well.
Other Devontae Smith.
Yeah, I feel less confident in the Alabama safeties. I think that's something you could take advantage of, and that's right up the seams with Whittington and JT Sanders. And you mentioned on a show we did a couple days ago, using those seams to build Quinn Ewers' confidence when it comes to the deep balls. And I think that's a great idea. I think it's something you can do this Saturday.
Potentially get Isaiah Nayor involved here too.
Mm-hmm. I think big bodies across the middle of the field are going to be advantageous for the Longhorns.
Yep. And you can get Nayor over the top. This is the guy that it was over 200 receiving yards on deep balls, either between the numbers or on the hashes. And so in Wyoming in 2021. And so he's been utilized there before. He's proven that he can be a zone buster, that he can make things happen over the middle. And I think he can give Alabama's defense problems on Saturday if Texas utilizes him the right way at the field receiver position. Maybe some 4 wideout sets. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can weaponize Isaiah Nayor. We talked about that, did an entire article on it on the site. But yeah, so you give the slight edge to Texas's receivers there.
Yep, I think the slightest of edges. I think it's going to be a fun matchup to watch just because of all the firepower with both units.
Okay, so that brings us to the offensive line versus Alabama's defensive line. I mean, I think that this one you actually can take matchup by matchup. I think it's important to look at it that way. I feel good about what we got at Christian Jones and Calvin Banks against Alabama, whether you're looking at their defensive, because they play like a 3-down front traditionally. And I mean, Chris Braswell or Dallas Turner coming off the edge. I think that's always a tough matchup. But Kelvin Banks held his own against Will Anderson last year. I have full confidence in him in this game. Obviously, he's one of the best offensive tackles in the nation. Talking about Banks, obviously. Christian Jones, I feel like he's still getting better, like in a very positive way. I posted this on Twitter earlier today on our Twitter page. He has the longest active streak of games in the Big 12 among starting offensive linemen without a blown block. It's at 4 or 5 games now. It's impressive, to say the very least. He was really the only, I think, Texas offensive lineman that was consistently solid against Rice on Saturday. And so, I feel good about the offensive tackles. The interior, Hayden Connor, I gotta say, might actually be the guy I'm the shakiest on. He had trouble pulling. He had trouble maintaining his blocking assignments. He got beat on swim moves twice that I saw on Saturday. One that almost resulted in a tackle for loss on Jaden Blue, but we talked about this before. He was able to cut it back inside and get a 19-yard gain. But I don't think that Jaden Blue is going to be able to have that same elusiveness against Alabama that you would against Rice. Those tacklers are going to collapse on him a lot faster. They're just that much more athletic. But, for Hayden Connor, he's got to turn a corner. It wasn't just the communication issues. It felt like he wasn't near physical enough. So I think he's the problematic area on the interior offensive line, at least from what I saw on film last week and even at times last season. Jake Majors, I actually think was really solid compared to the other interior offensive linemen in week 1. But, some of that responsibility is still on him for some of those miscommunications. He's the guy that's got to be the glue anchoring the offensive line. He's got a huge responsibility this weekend. He's got to be on top of it. He's got to be communicating, got to make sure he's keeping up with adjustments, audibles at the line of scrimmage. Because if not, that crowd noise is going to get to him. Those interior pass rushers start getting to Quinn Ewers, and the run game's not going to stand a chance. It's already going to have a lot of challenges to get going. And I think Cole Hudson's an X factor. If Cole Hudson plays as well as he did last year, I think he played. I remember we talked about this after the game last year. He was really commendable for how good he played as a true freshman against Alabama. And I know he's dealt with injury. He didn't play in week 1, I believe, because of injury. So we'll see there. There's a lot of X factors at work for Cole Hudson. If he plays as well as he did or better than he did last year, that will, I think, completely transform the way this Texas offensive line looks. So then I think you have 4 solid guys, and we'll see with Hayden Connor. They've got probably 6 guys along the defensive front that I think can give Texas issues, at least 6 guys. And then you get to the linebackers and the edges, and Chris Braswell, I think Tresman Marshall in the middle. I know he's not an edge rusher, but I think in the middle he's pretty solid. Dallas Turner, we all know what he can do.
It's unfortunate that DJ Campbell got injured, but I think for this matchup specifically, having Cole Hudson back in there could bring, a level of continuity to this line that they need to have success against Bama. I mean, Texas struggled with communication at home against Rice. What do you think this offensive line is going to do on the road against Alabama? Like, it's probably not going to be very pretty. Coming into the season, we were all very high on the Texas offensive line. I think rightfully so. We might have gotten, a little bit ahead of our skis there. I think, the Alabama.
I'll butt in. I don't think we were. They returned all 5 starters and the number 1 interior offensive line recruit in the nation in the 2022 class that was pushing for starting reps and looked solid down the stretch after he was broken into games. I don't think that was unfounded confidence. That is a recipe for success and continuity. And it just, there's questions. There's questions that are a little bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah, I think, and then you have to ask yourself, those questions come from what we saw against Rice, but, why did they happen? Why was the communication so poor? And those, at least I don't have the answers to those. So hopefully they get better is kind of my way to look at it. I have no other, because like you just said, the Texas offensive line, especially towards the end of last season, was very, very good. So we expected that to continue this season, and it did not through 60 minutes of football. So, I mean, I think you got to give you can go ahead.
I'll butt in here because I'm kind of tired at this point, so we'll wrap this up here shortly. I did forget to say, there was the Baylor game where Texas's offensive line had some issues against ghost fronts, those like simulated pressures, like, bringing up sometimes cover 0 looks at the line of scrimmage. You bring 7, 8 guys up to the line, and then you drop back 2 or 3 and send another 4 or 5 at the quarterback. And Texas struggled with those stunts last season. Alabama got some pressure in that way, but Baylor really took advantage of that. Washington had some looks, but it was more Baylor. And so I think that I think that Alabama's going to do some of that this weekend. Here's my thing, is that if this game is in DKR this year, I'm probably picking Texas to win. It being at Bryant-Denny, I do think is probably anywhere between a 3 to 7 point swing, just as you mentioned, how things can spiral in that atmosphere for the Texas offense against the pressure of that Alabama defense and that crowd noise. I made my score prediction yesterday, or I gave one, and I'm kind of sticking to it. I thought it was going to change. It hasn't. I said 24-21 Bama. That's where I'm still at.
I'm at 27-20 Alabama.
So we got to get. Oh no. Tarek said. So do you want to know what Nash and Tarek said yesterday, or I don't know if you saw it.
Probably. I have not seen it yet. No. Fill me in.
So you know how Tarek's usually the most like the most optimistic of us 3.
Yeah.
So he picked Texas by 10, I do believe.
Okay.
Nash picked Texas to win 38-21.
Hey, I hope he's right.
Yeah, same here. I was the pessimistic one last season. I picked Texas to lose by, I think it was 21 or 24 points. And so we'll see. But I've got a lot closer margins this year, and I think we know more about what both teams will be in this matchup in the back end of the home and home.
Yeah, I would be surprised if either team wins by double digits.
I can see Alabama winning by double digits with a late touchdown.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it will be a close game throughout, though.
Yeah, same here. The only way that I could see this being blown open is if Alabama does find a way to get over the top or get some big plays on the Texas defense.
Yeah. I said this earlier, but I do think there's going to be a period in the middle of the game where the Texas offense kind of stalls out, and that's going to be on Sarkisian. Like, this is what you get. This is what specifically he gets paid for, to scheme open guys in the biggest games of the season. So I hope he's ready. I think he will be ready. But there are going to be times where the offense looks a little flat, and it's going to be on him to get Ewers and these receivers and whatever semblance of a rushing attack is there back on track, because he has to be ready for a scenario in which the Alabama defensive line is completely dominating the Texas offensive line. Like, there has to be some break in case of emergency scenarios, and I think he will have those ready.
It can't be a repeat of the Arkansas game, I guess, is basically what we're saying.
Exactly. Yes. Cannot be one-dimensional.
Yeah. And so, well, I guess this is a good way to cap it here, because this was a good in-depth preview, I think. So, kept the energy up best I could. So, last week, what did you have? Like 50-something to 10?
I had 55-13 was my prediction.
Okay, so by nature of you being the closest, of all of ours being pretty wrong, you are in first place.
Leader in the clubhouse. Let's go.
This season, yeah. We had kind of an incomplete scoreboard last year. I know that Tark was the closest in 2 games. So I actually had to tally this by some of the predictions on the site, because Tark wasn't there for 2 of the videos. But then I also had to include Carson, and he was actually the closest on another 2 of them. I was closest on 5. I don't remember what that leaves you, because that would have left you at the closest on the rest of them.
So 5 for you, 2 for Carson, 2 for Tarek.
We finished 8 and 5. So so then we tied for first.
I think I got 4 then.
Well, no, because we had. Well, oh yeah, sorry. 8 plus 5 is 13. Yeah, 13.
So I'll take second. I will stand chest high with second place.
Okay, but I don't know how that would have gone if we removed Carson. It was kind of an incomplete thing.
Okay, so, yeah, incomplete. Let's mark it with the I. I'm good with that too.
Well, we have score predictions through the first 2 weeks now. You got the lead after week 1.
Let's go. I hope after week 2, I don't have the lead anymore. Put it that way, because I have 27-20 Alabama winning, and I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, this doesn't get you much beyond brownie points. It's a lot more fun to cover a win.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
yeah.
You got anything else to add before we get going here?
No, I'll drop the crazy Nick Saban stat, just so everyone's aware. He's 103-8 as the Alabama head coach inside Bryant-Denny, and in non-conference games, that number is 45-1, with the 1 loss coming to ULM in 2007, 16 years ago. So
it's a crazy loss to look back at.
Yeah, so I think since then it's been 43-0 in non-conference games at home. Granted, most of the time Alabama plays non-conference games at home. It's against G5 programs, but that is definitely just something to be aware of.
Yeah, this is a completely different level than they usually face, because usually their big non-conference games are a neutral site.
Yep, so. Exactly.
All right. Well, for Andrew Miller, Shane Black at OakhamHeadlines.com, we will see y'all this weekend. Unless I'll probably have another video or 2 coming up this week, I'm sure. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. Oakham.